Hey riders, Eric with Ride Adventures here, and also with me is Andrew Murray, one of our lead instructors here in Bend, Oregon. Andrew's been doing some riding not only on his Ducati Desert X recently, but also the Africa Twin, and we both thought it would be maybe useful to some of you to have a comparison of these two bikes. You know, they're very similar in some ways and kind of complement each other, and so thought we'd go through a handful of categories here, both on-road, off-road, you know, get the whole gamut of the thing. What's the breakdown of these two bikes? What do you think? Like,
sure. There seems to be a comparison video on almost every pair of similar bikes. But when I went out looking on YouTube for comparison videos for the Africa Twin versus the Desert X, I saw very little. I mean, I saw a couple that were AI generated. They were kind of in a robot voice, just naming specs. You know, when I came to you with this idea, I thought, you know, sort of a rider's seat of the pants perspective on these two bikes. First of all, I think if anyone's looking at a Desert X to buy, they probably ought to consider an Africa Twin. And if someone's looking at Africa Twin, they really ought to consider a Desert X. Also, I think they're very comparable bikes. Most riders don't have an opportunity to really spend time on either bike if they don't own them. I'm in a lucky position. You know, I've got the Desert X, and we have this Africa Twin in our rental fleet that I've, you know, now spent a fair amount of time on-road, off-road, a lot of different sort of situations. I hope in this video I can kind of give a good seat of the pants perspective on what these bikes are like to ride on, off-road, what they're like to sort of live with.
So each bike comes with a few model variants. What do we have here?
Yeah, so let's talk about the variants. So first of all, Desert X currently comes in now 3 variants. There's the standard Desert X, which is behind me here, the bike that I own. There's the Desert X Rally that just came out in 2024, and that's, if you think about a KTM 890R and a KTM 890R Rally, the Desert X and the Desert X Rally are very similar in that respect. The Desert X Rally is like another 1.5 inches of suspension, better suspension. Otherwise, it's all the same motor and chassis. It's just way better tuned up suspension. And then now there's the Desert X Discovery, which is, as near as I can tell, I haven't seen one, but as near as I can tell, it is a Desert X that comes standard with panniers and protection package and a few other bolt-on goodies. Africa Twins, right? So first of all, across the Africa Twins, there's a manual transmission available and an automatic, what they call DCT, dual clutch transmission. Today, we're talking about a manual transmission Africa Twin. Also within Africa Twin, there's the Africa Twin and there's the Africa Twin Adventure Sports. I think if you're talking about an Africa Twin Adventure Sports, then a good comparison bike would be something like a BMW R1250 GSA, right? The taller, bigger one with the bigger tank.
Oops.
So the Africa Twin Adventure Sports has got a bigger tank, bigger fairing. Now in 2024, it's more road focused than the Africa Twins were before, because now it comes with a 19-inch front wheel and a lower suspension. Today's comparison, we're talking about a standard Desert X compared to a standard manual transmission Africa Twin. So that's what we're talking about today.
Easy one here, the weight difference.
Without question, the Africa Twin is heavier, both on paper and in the way it feels. And in fact, I think the feeling is more than the on paper spec. I think there's, what do we say, 16 pounds?
16 pound difference.
But I will tell you, when you lift the bike off the side stand, when you push it around your garage, the bike feels heavier.
The Africa Twin.
Yeah, the Africa Twin.
And more than 16 pounds, it feels.
And more than 16 pounds.
It's weird how that works out.
Yeah, and I don't know why. I think it might be some top heaviness. Despite its looks, the Desert X holds its weight pretty low because of the engine design. In sort of all situations, both good and bad, the Africa Twin feels heavier.
All right, let's get out of the way the pricing between these two, at least as far as the pricing here in the U.S. goes. What can riders expect?
Sure. So where the Desert X is a clear winner on weight, the Africa Twin's a clear winner on price. I see advertised prices for standard Desert X in the around $18,000 plus fees. I see advertisements from dealers for brand new 2024 Africa Twins in the $14,000 range plus fees. So that's a big chunk. And that's just getting started. The Desert X comes pretty bare bones, doesn't include a center stand, doesn't include a rear tail rack, and parts for it are really expensive.
What about the power differences between these two bikes?
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about the power and engine. Desert X, more horsepower. It is immediately noticeable when you're on the highway at 65 miles an hour and you roll on the throttle, you get up to 85 very quickly without downshifting. You get there pretty fast on the Africa Twin, but not as fast. So more horsepower on the Desert X, it's 110. The 2022 Africa Twin is 97 horsepower. The 2024, they've bumped it up, I think 6%, so it's a little bit over 100 horsepower. So horsepower, for sure, winner on the Desert X. Torque, okay, which is another issue. I think torque, the Africa Twin is the winner on torque. It rolls out of a low RPM sort of roll-on throttle situation better, more smoothly, more comfortably, more confidently than the Desert X does. At the same sort of low RPM roll-on, you'll get a little chug out of the Desert X. I like the low-end torque. I like better on the Africa Twin.
Low end is nice. That
The
grunt,
low end, yeah.
you don't have to wind it up at all.
Yeah, and I mean, that could be like sort of low speed off-road handling in second gear where now you got to roll on the throttle to get through some sand, or you just want to bump up the speed, or it might be around town, sort of just being able to keep the bike in, fewer shifts, keep it in one gear for longer, moving through town and things like that.
What about actual like riding situations, like on-road comfort? If you just think about the word comfort and as it is on pavement.
We're talking about on-road comfort. Let's first talk about wind management, okay? Windscreens. On the 2022 Africa Twin, it's a very short, I call it a bikini style windshield. I mean, it's really short. The Desert X obviously is taller. The stock Desert X windscreen is taller. I actually have a taller than stock windscreen on mine. Regardless, the Desert X has a taller windscreen than the 2022 Africa Twin. What that translates to is at highway speed, you feel on the Africa Twin, you feel more air pressure on your upper body. But I felt at 6'1", I'm 6'1", I sit kind of tall in the seat, but I'm normally proportioned. I got cleaner air in my helmet with the Africa Twin. It's clean air, but more sort of air pressure overall on my upper body. I can feel more wind pressure on my upper body. On the Desert X, I probably have more weather protection. It's a little bit less pressure on my upper body, but turbulence and buffeting is more pronounced on the Desert X. I mean, basically that turbulence point on the Africa Twin hits me right about here. On the Desert X, it hits me like right here in the forehead.
Right here. Not here or here so much, but right here.
Moves my helmet around. It vibrates my peak if I'm wearing the peak. In terms of which one's the clear winner, there isn't a clear winner. They both have their issues. They both handle and manage the wind a little bit differently. Neither one of them are great.
And within that, what you said, everybody's torso is different. Everybody's helmet might be different.
Yeah.
As speeds change, it's...
Another factor of road comfort is heat. And the Africa Twin generates less engine heat than the Desert X. And I notice that difference also. I notice it when I ride the Desert X.
Pouring up from beneath?
Just really sort of my legs and my butt. They're just kind of, I wouldn't say roasting, but almost, it's a warm. Nuts. Yeah, it's a warm bike. It's a warm bike. And also the lower body protection. So your legs are more protected on the Africa Twin. They're really sort of tucked in, just the aerodynamics of the tank, the way the tank bulges out, and the way your legs tuck in, they're just more protected.
And what about the seats between them?
I'd almost call that a draw. They're slightly different seat styles. The seat style on the Africa Twin is a little bit closer to an enduro or dual sport style seat. It's a little more basic with less sort of shape to it. And the Desert X has got not really a bucket that your butt sits in, but it's just a little wider and flared out a little bit more in the back. So it's just a little bit, the seat's a little bit more comfortable for a long road ride on the Desert X.
And that is a factor with the vibrations that are coming through the bike. What do you feel between these two?
Okay, vibration. So I really thought my Desert X was a really smooth running bike. And then I refreshed that memory by getting on my friend's R1250 GSA. I'm like, oh yeah, that's what a smooth bike feels like. The Desert X is more high frequency vibration than the Africa Twin. The Africa Twin, the best way I can describe it is the Africa Twin just feels a little more relaxed at speed. Anything in the 60 mile per hour up to 85 miles per hour, Africa Twin feels very relaxed, it's just the engine doesn't feel like it's running as fast as it is. In fact, it is running at a lower RPM than the Desert X at the same speeds. But you notice that. There's a little bit less tingling in your fingers and in your toes. And less vibration coming up through the seat.
Because of that lower end grunt, the lower revs, you're able to keep the revs lower.
Yeah, I mean, I think the bike is geared taller so that at the same speeds, it's turning less RPMs, but at the same RPMs, the Africa Twin is a smoother engine.
I think the internal counterbalancing and situation aside, there's also that the Desert X is 13.3 to 1 compression ratio versus 10.5 to 1 on the Honda. And that to me is always going to play out to be a more poppier bike, a little more of a shaky engine.
Yeah.
The higher that's pumping up tight in there, it's just going to shake a little more.
And I think for every rider that would prefer a bike that's a little smoother and a little more relaxed, there's a rider that prefers a bike that's a little more high strung. Okay. And I think that's the way to describe it. I think the Italian bike's a little more high strung. I think the Japanese bike is a little more zen.
This is not the first time this has happened between a bike comparison too. It's yeah. All right. So that was the on-road comfort situation. What about the on-road handling? I'm really curious. What do you think about the two bikes and the twisties? Both 21-inch front wheels, both 18 rear, as far as I know. The Desert X is 18 rear, right?
18 rear. It's a 2118. They're both 2118s.
We're comparing two apples here in a lot of ways. Which one's better on the pavement?
So I think, again, it goes to, do you prefer a more touring style ride, or do you prefer a more sport bike style ride? I think the Desert X, if you want a bike that feels closer to a sport bike than any probably other adventure bike, it's the Desert X. And maybe the Triumph Tiger Rally Pro, the 900 Rally Pro is in that category too. Very sporty feeling on the road. The Africa Twin feels very relaxed, very comfortable. I think in a sort of, if you want a relaxed touring kind of ride and feel, that's the Africa Twin.
Let's throw some words past you. So in terms of twisties though, flickability, we use the term bouncing back and forth.
Desert X.
A little lighter, a little more agile. What about how that front end, both 21s again, how does it bite? Does that front end want to walk a little bit on the twisties, or is one better than the other?
So I'm not going to say I ride either one of these bikes hard enough to feel a front end starting to walk out from under me.
You're not lapping yourselves not timing yourselves on a stopwatch on a Tuesday morning?
No, but they both feel very planted, very comfortable. We talked about flickability, sort of side to side. It's less effort moving from one side to the other on the Desert X, tipping it in and bringing it back up. It just feels a little bit lighter, a little bit more nimble in that regard. They both have a very nice, planted, stable, sporty feeling ride on the road, especially for a 21-inch front wheel bike.
All right, but while you're handling it through those turns, how does either bike perform with crosswinds? Is that a factor?
Yeah, so if you're talking about I'm on an interstate, or if I'm just on a country road and a truck going the other direction, the Africa Twin feels more planted. I think that's the weight. I'm not sure what else would sort of contribute to that, but it felt more relaxed. I think I've used that word a couple times. It just feels more relaxed, more planted on the road at speed than the Desert X does. And that's not to suggest that the Desert X is not planted or doesn't feel stable. It just felt like you could set the cruise control and just kind of relax if you wanted to on the Africa Twin a little bit more.
Okay, so as far as the sporty performance and the twisties and things like that, we can see the Ducati being a little more advanced. What about a pure touring situation? Like if you're going for travel and not necessarily how fast you get there, you want to be comfortable.
Eric, if I was going to go out on a multi-day, nearly all road touring kind of ride, I'd take the Africa Twin.
Less vibration,
less heat. Again, I'll use the word relax. You feel more relaxed. I feel like, although I didn't get a multi-day sort of tour experience on the Africa Twin, I feel pretty confident that if I went out and spent, a typical weekend or 3-day kind of road ride experience on the Africa Twin, I'd come back a little less fatigued.
A little more buttery, that thing.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
And if you're not touring alone, by the way, what if you got a passenger?
Yeah, it's hard for me to speak to that. I don't.
You didn't test it yet, but you can kind of imagine probably.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if there's really a difference in terms of comfort, passenger comfort. We've got 6,000 feet passes all around us here in Central Oregon. And I think if you had luggage on the bike and a passenger and you're going up over a 6,000 foot summit, as you're approaching it, I think you'd be a little happier on the Ducati with a little more horsepower. You'd probably notice the difference once you got off of that, sort of where you're really looking for every bit of horsepower that you have. Maybe the Desert X and the Africa Twin are pretty comparable. They seem to have about the same amount of cockpit room. I'd be surprised. Like I said, all of my bikes have the passenger pegs removed, so I don't ever ride with a passenger. It's hard for me to speak to that. I can't imagine there's a clear winner between either one of them.
Those who have ridden as passenger, please comment.
Yeah, love to hear some feedback from some people that have ridden with passengers on either one of them.
It's a factor because it all ties into comfort and longevity on a ride and being able to stay fresh.
And the hard part is, we'd love to hear some feedback from some people that have got experience, with passengers on either one of these bikes. The reality is, though, unless you've sort of done it on both bikes, it's hard to really get a sense for what's happening there.
For sure.
I don't know anyone that doesn't think that their bike feels great.
Well, why would we own it or ride it if we didn't? All right, on-road handling. What about the brakes between these? Is there a stark difference?
Ducati, clear winner. I mean, I ride my Ducati with one finger on the front brake lever, and that's all I ever need for every kind of braking situation. That's not the case with the Africa Twin. It's a 2-finger levered bike. It just does not slow down and stop nearly as efficiently in a composed manner as the Ducati. The Ducati is really it's top of the class.
And suspension?
Okay, so, on spec, on paper, Ducati's got a better suspension package. I think, if you just look at it on paper. There is an electronic suspension version of the Africa Twin in other markets other than the U.S., but in 2024, you can't get the electronic suspension on the standard Africa Twin. Okay, so comparing suspensions one to the other, I don't really see a clear winner other than the Ducati is lighter. I think it has lighter unsprung weight. I mean, I know that Ducati has made a very serious effort to keep that bike under 500 pounds. So they did everything they could to save weight on the bike. They did not include engine bars and only a real flimsy bottom, whatever, skid plate, bash plate, whatever. And consequently, the wheels, brakes, all the wheels and brakes and rotors, all that unsprung weight is really, really light. It's really easy to damage the Ducati wheels. So I've heard.
Both tubeless, by the way.
Yeah. No. So, okay. So that's a good one. 2024 is the first year of tubeless wheels on the standard Africa Twin. All the way up until 2024, standard Africa Twins are tubed. I think the unsprung weight on the Ducati is less. It's got lighter weight wheels. They spec'd it with lighter weight rims, and you can just kind of feel that. The way the suspension is lively, it's responsive, and I think that has something to do with sort of the flickability of the bike. The suspension feels better on the Ducati, and I think that's partly a function of just lighter weight and lighter weight materials in the unsprung category. When you get off the road, you definitely feel the weight difference. The suspensions don't feel too much different in that they both go through the rear suspension travel pretty easily on like compressions, G-outs, kind of whoops kind of stuff. I took the Africa Twin out in some, an area that I'm real familiar with, having ridden my Desert X and my 790 through there a lot of times on guided rides that we do. I went through the travel really quick on the Africa Twin, and I go through the travel pretty quick on those whoops on my Desert X. So I wouldn't say a clear winner. Definitely the Desert X feels better, lighter, a little more lively, a little more responsive in the chassis and suspension department off-road.
Okay.
Yeah.
And as a reference, you told us you're 6'1". Do you mind sharing how much you weigh, Andrew?
Right at 200 pounds.
Okay. So as a reference for those who are wondering how they might fit and feel on this thing,
yeah.
Could you stick with the original suspension and springs on each bike? Probably. You might have to preload things a little bit, but maybe swapping out those springs might.
Yeah, so, I just recently swapped out, thanks to Darren at M9 Suspension here in Redmond, Oregon. We swapped out the springs and revalved the Desert X rear suspension. That definitely gives it, keeps it up in the suspension better than what did it in its stock configuration. I just got done with a 3-day tour on the Desert X, and it was loaded up with gear, and I was able to get in 30% of sag. Before that, I couldn't even get 30% sag just without any extra gear on, just my day riding gear. So I think they both, a guy my size, they're both going to benefit from either respringing or revalving or both of the rear suspension and probably the front.
Keep the geometry where it's supposed to be.
Keep it where it's supposed to be without loading the preload all the way down.
Okay, so again, we're done with the road. Now we're going off-road.
Yeah.
First topic, sand.
Talking about sand, I took both bikes through we have a 300-foot long sand pit here at our training facility in Bend, and they're both very confident, inspiring in the sand. They've both got 27 or more degrees of rake. They're just nicely balanced. They've got the right kind of suspension. They're not twitchy. That 21-inch front tire just digs in. And even, on very sort of non-aggressive tires on the Africa Twin and just sort of moderate Mitas EO7s on my Desert X, both bikes feel great in the sand. A little bit of skill goes a long ways on either of these bikes. If your idea of off-road is like gravel roads and dirt roads, I got to say the Africa Twin was just so stable and so confidence-inspiring on gravel. I couldn't pick a winner there. I think that's going to be about, more about tires than anything.
And to me, almost any time a bike is heavier.
Yeah, and I think heavy wheels have something to do with that too. I think especially when you get the wheels are a little heavier on gravel, they tend to just be a little bit more stable at the same speeds.
Okay, we touched on the suspension for the on-road, again for off-road. Suspension performance of the two in the off-road scenario, if you had to pick one.
If I had to pick one, I'd pick the Desert X. It feels lighter. The suspension feels more responsive. They both tend to go through their rear and suspension travel pretty quickly. But I think the Desert X, the bike just feels lighter off-road as soon as things get any dicier than just sort of typical gravel roads.
What about the ergonomics of these bikes, at least as they come originally, or however you feel difference? They're very similar stature, size.
Yeah, when you look at them side by side, they look pretty similar. They're both very, very comfortable sitting or standing. I'll give the sitting comfort edge to the Africa Twin, even though maybe the seat on the Desert X is a little more comfortable. The way the bars come up and meet you, especially for road riding in the saddle, long distances, it just felt more comfortable. I just wasn't reaching as far forward for the bars. But at the same time, I didn't feel cramped. Standing, they both stand very easily. They're both very confident, inspiring when you're standing on the bike. They lend themselves well to standing. As soon as you stand, you really feel in command of the bike. But that said, I felt like I could stand all day on the Africa Twin in a comfortable manner. It just, the bars were just right at that right point. Both bikes are without risers. At 6'1", I would not want risers on either bike. The ergonomic position is great on both of them.
Yeah, I noticed the Africa Twin risers, at least the OEM risers, are just a bit longer from factory.
Yeah. I mean just the stock Africa Twins got risers. What look like risers on them, and they're rubber mounted, so it's a little bit different. But that might have something to do with why there's less vibration feel in the bars. Who knows? But yeah, when you look at a stock configured Africa Twin, it almost looks like someone's added risers to it.
Yeah, they're much longer. All right, what about living with these things? It's not just the fact of buying it. We know which one's more expensive, but what about going on living with these things? Which one's going to be better from the standpoint of fuel? What are your options out there in the world?
Yeah, so that's a great one because, if your idea of living with either one of these bikes is, say, traveling through Baja or, maybe backroad discovery routes, fuel can be a concern. The Africa Twin is designed to and runs great on regular fuel, what we call regular fuel here in the U.S., which is like octane 87. Desert X really doesn't want to run on anything below 92.
13.3 to 1?
13.3 to 1, yeah. Compression ratio.
Needs that high octane.
Yep, needs high octane or else it's going to ping and not run as well.
And both fuel mapping systems should take care of this stuff largely for you, but to already be painted into the corner where you want that premium.
Yeah, I mean, you're not going to, if you do a trip through Baja and you have to run regular fuel, you're not going to ruin your Ducati. You're not going to blow the engine up because you put regular fuel in it, but it's not going to run as well as it's intended to run.
Yeah.
And you're paying $1 less per gallon. Prime example, last year we rode the Idaho BDR. I was on my BMW R1250 GS. Most of the fuel that we got came out of like steel cans behind a bar or a restaurant with a hand pump, and it was regular. And that GS did not run very well on regular fuel.
Another high compression engine.
Yeah, after about 600 or 700 miles of regular fuel, man, that bike was making a lot of noise, was pinging, and so that's a factor. $1 less per gallon, easier access. Even here in Central Oregon, you pull into town sometimes, and they just have one pump. It's regular.
All right. As far as living with or around the bike, what about the electronics, the general controls and the switches and stuff?
I'm going to give the clear victory there to the Desert X. I mean, it is, first of all, the electronics are very intuitive It takes someone just showing you real quickly how to change the ride modes on it, and it's easy peasy. And you can do it all while you're riding. What I really like about the electronics on the Desert X is the traction control, the ABS, and the power mapping or the engine mapping are all connected into one mode. And you can change those parameters within that mode. For instance, I've got my road set up exactly the way I like it with the engine map I like. I've got my off-road, it's called Enduro, set up exactly the way I like it with the certain engine mapping, certain traction control. Then I have a second off-road engine mapping or mode that I can set up exactly what I want. When I change it, I get all those parameters changed at once. The Africa Twin, you have a riding mode, but then every time you shut the engine off, however you set the traction control and the ABS goes back to like a default. So you turn the bike back on, you stay in the same riding mode, but now it asks you, well, no, it doesn't ask you. Now you have to change the ABS back into, if you want, like for instance, I like to ride off-road with the rear ABS deactivated and the front ABS active. That's their off-road mode. When I go to change that on the Africa Twin, it's like 3 button pushes. Then it asks me if I'm sure I want to do that. Okay. To me, that's just so infuriating.
Sitting there in the sun.
Fiddling around. The guys you're riding with are already taken off and you're fiddling around with, are you sure you want to turn your ABS off? I just don't know why that has to be the case, but it is. Second thing, controls, right? I think on my Desert X, besides the required controls that are on the left side, which is like your high beam switch and your horn and your blinkers, right? Those are just there on both bikes, right? The Desert X got 2 buttons that control everything, including cruise control. And it's really easy and simple. On the Africa Twin, man, I spent like an hour last night online trying to figure out how to change things. They've got that ABS thing, and there's like 8 buttons. I don't know how many buttons there are. There's a bunch of buttons on the left side.
There's a lot more going on.
Way more buttons. Nothing's intuitive. I never have to look at my hand to know what button I'm pushing on the Desert X. I just look at the screen as the menu changes. On the Africa Twin, I'm looking at my hand, I'm looking at the screen. I'm looking at my hand, I'm looking at the screen. I don't like it. For me, it's almost a reason why I might never own an Africa Twin.
Wow.
Yeah.
Despite the many good things you've said about the bike.
What a great bike it is. I mean, when someone comes up with a dongle that fixes that and it's like, 1 or 2 buttons to solve that, then, that might be a different story. Yeah, so the riding mode's better on the Desert X. The ability to control them, better on the Desert X. The simplicity, better on the Desert X. Okay, all of that said, Africa Twin's got Apple CarPlay, and that is cool.
And the Google one?
Whatever the Android.
It'll work on both systems.
Whatever it's called. I forget what it's called.
Yeah.
But we know what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
It's the 2 cool phone apps that basically, like you have in cars now, that link your phone right into the car system. You plug your phone in, and all of a sudden you've got, if you're off-road, you've got Gaia, you've got Onyx, you've got whatever you use for off-road navigation, you've got Google Maps, you got the world. Everything that's in your phone, you've got on the dash screen of your Africa Twin, and then you still have a little smaller screen below that's got your gear position.
So you don't lose that stuff.
Yeah, so you don't lose all the important stuff: gear position, fuel tank, and speed.
Yeah,
I could almost say that's like it's a tie, except that the buttons and menu and ride modes and nanny state sort of control of like, are you sure you want your ABS off? It's just like, that's too much of a negative to overcome the positive of CarPlay.
Okay, and it might be different for other people.
Yeah.
Those of us that don't use CarPlay or whatever, it's maybe not a factor.
And like if you hardly ever go off-road, if you hardly ever want you're
not switching modes.
Yeah, if you never want your rear ABS to be deactivated, more power to you. And if that's the case, then that's probably not going to annoy you nearly as much as it annoys me.
All right, what about the maintenance and dealer network situation for each of these brands?
Yeah, great question. 2 years ago, I rode the Washington BDR. And in the course of that route, I probably rode within 20 miles. It's all off-road, but I probably was within 20 miles of 3 different Honda dealerships. And I probably never got closer than a few hours to a Ducati dealership. Yeah. If you sort of extrapolate that across the country, it's the same, right? There's a handful of Ducati dealerships, and you can barely throw a rock out the window or off the side of your Africa Twin without hitting a Honda dealership.
Such as probably true around the world, not just
it's true around the world. Yeah. So all of that aside, I would say that here in Bend, the closest Ducati dealer is Portland, Oregon. That's Moto Corsa. If you're going to ride 3 hours to go to a Ducati dealership, it's great if it's Moto Corsa because that place is really cool. That is a great dealership. And I would say that if anyone's going to buy a Ducati Desert X, if you're anywhere near Portland, Oregon, that's the place to buy one from. The last time I was there, I had some warranty work done on the Desert X. They had everything set up for me, so I got in there and they did it while I was waiting. I went and had lunch with the GM. We had a great conversation. Shaheen and his team there are consummate pros. Yeah, there's not too many Ducati dealerships around, but the one that I'm used to going to is a great one.
I can't hear Moto Corsa and not think about the Manigali calendar from about 10 years ago. So maybe we can throw a few B-roll shots of that on the screen. But yeah, no, a reputation, for a great reputation for a dealership. Yeah, but the Honda's got the advantage overall worldwide as far as
and
parts availability too and everything. It's just,
and so a couple other things. I've mentioned it before in the review of my Desert X that we did a few months ago. To change a air filter, you got to pull the fuel tank off. It's a big job. I've heard of some people like they are bragging that now they're really good at it and they're doing it in about an hour or an hour and a half. I can change the air filter on an Africa Twin in about 20 minutes. So I think 20 minutes total for both sides. There's two air filters.
I should say it depends on crash bars and things like that you might have in the way.
Yeah. The Africa Twin's got 2 air filters, but they're a lot quicker to change. Oil change is easy peasy on either bike. Valve changes and valve adjustments. The Ducati is a Desmodromic valve train. It is not cheap to do a valve train adjustment on that bike.
It's a pretty good interval. I think it's around 15,000 miles.
I think it's 18,000
18 is it?
18,
okay.
yeah. And the Honda is not easy. The tank's got to come off because it's, it's a overhead cam engine. It's still a lot easier, a lot cheaper. And so there's that.
Which of the two bikes is the better conversation starter?
Yeah, better conversation starter. Clearly, I think the Ducati takes the win in that category. If you're the kind of guy that wants to ride a bike where people stop and go, "Hey, what kind of bike is that?" Or
a Honda Accord or
who
a
makes
Ferrari?
that?
Which one is it?
Yeah.
No, not that the Africa Twin is anything like the Accord, but you know what I mean. It's just a little more exotic. The Ducati.
Yeah, you'll definitely have more people coming up to you and asking you what it's like, how it rides, where'd you get it, how, what do you think of it, who makes that, what country did that come from, blah, 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 blah. So if you like having a little bit more unique bike, I think, the Ducati is the winner on that category.
Then with all this reasoning and, examples of both inside, if you had to say, which of the bikes is best for me?
Yeah, for you, for everyone.
I need the facts here. Which one is the best for me?
Look,
it's got to be the truth.
Anyone that gets on YouTube or anywhere else and says, this is the bike you ought to own, it just doesn't make sense, right? Because everyone's got different parameters. What hopefully is coming out from this video is enough information about both bikes so that someone that, whatever kind of rider they are, can have a little bit better sense of what these bikes are to own and live with and ride. If you want a more comfortable touring, kind of relaxed bike that occasionally you're going to go off-road, Africa Twin's great. If you want a bike that's a little more exciting on the road and it's got more capability off-road at the expense of maybe some sort of long riding comfort, the Desert X is the way to go. If money's not an object and you're tossing a coin, Desert X is really compelling. If money is an object, you want to get, a fully equipped bike with panniers and racks and whatever crash protection you need, all of that stuff rolling out of the dealership for probably under like $17,000. Africa Twin, it's right there. You're going to be well over $20,000 to have a Desert X equipped like that. So yeah, I'm not going to say one bike's better than the other. You've heard sort of my opinions on things I like and things I don't like. I will say there are things I love about the Africa Twin. There are things I love about the Desert X. There's a couple things I really don't like about the Africa Twin, that switch gear, the ride modes. There's a couple things I really don't like about the Desert X. The lack of a prolific dealer network, the expense of aftermarket parts, some of the maintenance stuff.
So as far as which one's best for me, it's both.
Yeah, exactly.
Or either.
N plus one.
Yeah, plus your current number of bikes plus one is
yep.
the correct number of bikes you're supposed to have. So.
Yeah. Hopefully this video is an opportunity for, like I said, someone that it's really hard to get a good test ride from dealers now. Every dealer I go into, I ask for a test drive. It's like, take 4 right-hand turns, come back into the dealership, and let us know what you think. Yeah. And it's like, I don't know how you sample a bike that way. I'm lucky. I own the Desert X. We've got the Africa Twin in our rental fleet. You know, I got to spend a lot of time on the Africa Twin, you know, just sort of sorting it out. I think this is the golden age of adventure bikes that we're living in right now.
Hitting a real fine spot here, aren't we? Yeah.
There's not a crappy bike in the bunch.
Well, thanks, Andrew, for coming in and sharing your thoughts on this.
Great to be here.
Thanks, everyone, for watching. If you have comments, we're watching the questions and things below these videos, so let us know if there's anything else we can help you out with. And thanks for watching, everyone. Ride on. See you out there.